A woman steps off a wagon in the dust with nothing but a carpet bag and a letter that says she isn't wanted. No money, no family, no way back. The man who finds her doesn't smile, doesn't promise anything, and doesn't ask her name before he offers her the one thing this land never gives for free: a chance. But out here, chances come with conditions, and survival doesn't wait for anyone to be ready. If you want to see how a woman with nothing and a man who trusts no one builds something that shouldn't be possible, stay with me to the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The heat didn't negotiate. It pressed down on the valley like a hand holding something underwater, and Caleb Mercer had long stopped expecting mercy from it. He rode along the fence line of the old Pritchard place, squinting against the glare bouncing off the baked dirt. The property had been empty for 2 months now, ever since Pritchard took fever and didn't come back from it. Caleb wasn't sentimental about it. Death was common enough. What bothered him was the waste. Good land going to scrub because no one had the spine to work it. He pulled his hat lower and was about to turn his horse when he saw her. A woman. Standing in the yard like she'd been dropped there by accident. Caleb reined in, his jaw tightening. She wasn't moving, just standing there beside a single carpet bag, her dress coated in trail dust, her face shadowed by a bonnet that had seen better days. No horse, no wagon in sight. Nothing but her and that bag and the sun beating down like it had a personal grudge. He didn't call out right away. He just watched, trying to piece it together. Women didn't appear out of nowhere, not this far from town. And they sure as hell didn't stand alone in a dead man's yard unless something had gone very wrong. Finally, he urged his horse forward, slow and cautious. She turned at the sound of hooves, and he got his first clear look at her face. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe late 20s, but her eyes didn't match. They were older, tired in a way that didn't come from a bad night's sleep. "You lost?" Caleb asked, his voice flat. She blinked at him, and for a second he thought she might not answer. Then she shook her head, just once. "No," she said, "I'm exactly where I was told to be." Her voice was steady, but there was something brittle underneath it. Caleb shifted in the saddle, his instincts prickling. This didn't make sense. Told by who? She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She didn't offer it to him, just held it in her hand like evidence. "A man named Joseph Pritchard," she said. "We had an arrangement." Caleb's stomach sank. He didn't need to see the letter to know what it said. He'd heard of this before, men out on the frontier advertising for brides, making promises through the mail, painting pictures of a life that didn't exist. Most of the time, the women showed up and made the best of it. Sometimes they didn't show up at all. And sometimes the men didn't either. "Pritchard's dead," Caleb said bluntly. 2 months now. Her face didn't change, but something in her posture did. It was small, just a slight shift in the way she held her shoulders, but Caleb saw it. "I see," she said quietly. She folded the letter back up, tucked it into her pocket, and looked around the empty yard like she was cataloging what wasn't there. Then she picked up her bag. "Where's the nearest town?" she asked. "Ridgewood, about 12 miles east." She nodded once, adjusted her grip on the bag, and started walking. Caleb sat there for a moment, watching her go. It wasn't his problem. She wasn't his responsibility. He had his own land to manage, his own fences to mend, his own problems that didn't include a stranger with bad luck and a carpet bag. But 12 miles in this heat on foot, with no water, she wouldn't make it. He swore under his breath and nudged his horse forward. "Hold up." She stopped but didn't turn around. "You got any money?" he asked. "No." "Any family in Ridgewood?" "No." "Anyone expecting you?" She turned then, and her expression was calm in a way that felt dangerous. "No," she said. "No one is expecting me." Caleb rubbed the back of his neck, already regretting what he was about to say. "My place is a mile west. You can stay there tonight. Get some food, some water. Figure out what's next in the morning." She studied him for a long moment, and he could see her weighing it, trusting a stranger versus walking into the heat with nothing. "Why?" she asked. It was a fair question. Caleb didn't have a good answer. "Because you won't make it to town," he said simply. She didn't thank him. She just nodded and followed when he turned his horse. They didn't talk on the way back. Caleb led, and she walked behind, keeping pace without complaint. He glanced back once or twice, half expecting her to falter, but she didn't. Her steps were steady, her back straight, even with the heat pressing down and the dust rising with every step. When they reached his property, she stopped at the edge of the yard and looked around. It wasn't much: a small house, a barn that leaned slightly to the left, a chicken coop, and a well. The land stretched out flat and stubborn in every direction, dotted with scrub and the occasional tree that had survived more out of spite than anything else. "It's not fancy," Caleb said, swinging down from his horse. "I wasn't expecting fancy," she replied. He tied off the horse and gestured toward the house. "You can sleep in the spare room. There's a pump out back for washing up. I'll get some food together." She followed him inside, and he was suddenly aware of how the place must look to someone else. He kept it clean enough, dishes washed, floor swept, but it was sparse. A table, 2 chairs, a stove, and not much else. The walls were bare, the windows small. It was a place built for function, not comfort. She set her bag down by the door and looked around without comment. "What's your name?" Caleb asked, pulling a pan from the shelf. "Eliza," she said. "Eliza Hartwell." He nodded and started slicing bread. "Caleb Mercer." She didn't offer anything else, and he didn't push. They ate in silence: bread, some cold chicken, a couple of boiled eggs. It wasn't much, but she ate every bite without hesitation. When they finished, he showed her to the spare room. It was small, just big enough for a narrow bed and a wooden crate that served as a table. The window looked out over the back of the property, where the land rolled into low hills. "I'll be up early," Caleb said from the doorway. "If you need anything, I'm just across the hall." "Thank you," Eliza said quietly. He nodded and left her alone. Caleb didn't sleep well that night. He kept waking up, listening to the silence, half convinced she'd be gone by morning. It wouldn't have surprised him. People ran. They always did, one way or another. But when he came out at dawn, she was already awake, standing by the stove with a pot of coffee brewing. "Didn't mean to wake you," she said. "You didn't." She poured him a cup without asking, and he took it, studying her over the rim. She looked tired, but no worse than the night before. Her hair was pinned back, her dress smoothed out as much as the dust would allow. "I'll head to town today," she said. "Find work if there is any." Caleb took a sip of coffee. It was strong, stronger than he usually made it. "What kind of work?" he asked. "Anything," she said simply. "I can cook, clean, mend. I've worked in a boarding house before." He nodded slowly, turning the cup in his hands. "There's not much in Ridgewood," he said. "It's a small town. Boarding house closed last year. Most folks do their own cooking." She didn't flinch. "Then I'll find something else." Caleb set the cup down and leaned back against the counter. "Or," he said carefully, "you could stay here." She looked at him, her eyes sharp. "In what capacity?" He appreciated that. No dancing around it, no pretending she didn't understand what he was asking. "You need a place to stay. I need help around here. The land's too much for one person, and I'm behind on half a dozen things. You work, you eat, you've got a roof. That's the deal." "And what else?" she asked. "Nothing else," Caleb said flatly. "You stay in your room, I stay in mine. You do your work, I do mine. No expectations beyond that." She studied him for a long moment, and he met her gaze without flinching. "Why?" she asked again. "Because I'm practical," he said, "and because you don't strike me as someone who'd take charity." That almost pulled a smile from her. Almost. "I'm not," she said. "Then we understand each other." She picked up her own cup, took a slow sip, and then nodded. "All right," she said. "I'll stay. Bob." Eliza Hartwell was not a woman who wasted time. Caleb learned that within the first hour. After they'd settled the terms, no written contract, just a handshake, and a mutual understanding that neither of them was particularly interested in sentiment, she asked him to show her the property. He walked her through it, pointing out the chicken coop, the garden plot that had gone mostly to weeds, the barn where he kept his 2 horses, and a milk cow that had a mean streak. She listened without interrupting, her eyes taking in every detail. When he finished, she nodded once and asked, "What needs doing first?" Caleb blinked. He'd expected questions, maybe some hesitation, but she was already rolling up her sleeves. "Garden's a mess," he said. "If you can get that cleared out, I can turn the soil tomorrow." "I'll start there," she said. And she did. He went about his own work, fixing a section of fence that had come loose, checking the water line, mucking out the barn. But every time he glanced toward the garden, she was still at it. She worked methodically, pulling weeds, clearing rocks, her movements efficient and unhurried. By midday, she'd cleared half the plot. When he brought her water, she took it without stopping. "You don't have to do it all in one day," he said. "I know," she replied, and kept working. By evening, the garden was clear. Caleb stood at the edge of it, hands on his hips, genuinely surprised. "You always work like that?" he asked. "Like what?" "Like you're trying to prove something." She straightened, wiping her hands on her apron, and looked at him evenly. "I am," she said. "I'm proving I'm worth keeping." It was the first truly honest thing she'd said, and it hit him harder than he expected. He didn't know how to respond, so he just nodded. "You're worth keeping," he said quietly. She didn't smile, but something in her face softened, just a fraction. About that. The days fell into a rhythm. Caleb had lived alone for nearly 3 years, and he'd gotten used to the silence, the predictability of it. But Eliza's presence changed things in small, unexpected ways. She woke before him most mornings, had coffee ready by the time he came out. She didn't talk much, but she was observant, noticed when supplies were running low, when a hinge on the barn door needed oil, when the cow was favoring her left hind leg. She cooked better than he did, which wasn't saying much, but she had a way of making simple food taste like something worth sitting down for. She mended his shirts without being asked, patched a hole in the roof of the chicken coop, and figured out how to coax the stubborn hand pump into working again when it seized up. And she never asked for anything. That bothered him, though he couldn't say why. It felt like she was keeping herself at a distance, like she was ready to leave at any moment and didn't want to get comfortable. One evening, about 2 weeks after she'd arrived, he found her sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the horizon. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, and she looked small against all that open space. He sat down beside her, not too close. "You settling in all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "You need anything?" "No." He nodded, drumming his fingers on his knee. The silence stretched out, not uncomfortable, just present. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally. She glanced at him. "Go ahead." "Why'd you come all the way out here? For a man you'd never met?" She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze turning back to the horizon. "I didn't have anywhere else to go," she said. "My parents died when I was 16. I worked at a boarding house in St. Louis for 8 years, saved every penny I could. When I saw the advertisement, I thought, maybe it was a chance, a way to have something of my own." "So you sold everything," Caleb said. "Everything," she confirmed. "Bought the train ticket, the stagecoach fare, a new dress. I thought I was being practical, investing in a future. And instead, you got nothing." She smiled then, but it wasn't a happy smile. "I got this," she said, gesturing to the land around them. "It's not nothing." Caleb looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something he hadn't expected. Resilience. Not the kind that came from never being knocked down, but the kind that came from getting back up every single time. "No," he said quietly. "It's not nothing. Go." The first real test came 3 weeks in. Caleb had ridden into town for supplies, leaving Eliza to manage the property for the day. He didn't think twice about it. She'd proven herself capable a dozen times over. But when he came back, he found her standing in the yard with a rifle in her hands and a dead coyote at her feet. He dismounted quickly, his heart kicking up. "What happened?" "It got into the chicken coop," she said calmly. "Killed 2 hens before I heard the noise." Caleb looked at the coyote, then at her. She was pale, her hand steady on the rifle, but her breathing a little too quick. "You ever shoot before?" he asked. "Once," she said. "My father taught me when I was 12. I wasn't very good." He looked at the coyote again, single shot, clean through the chest. "You got better," he said. She lowered the rifle and let out a shaky breath. "I didn't know if I'd hit it," she admitted. "I just didn't want to lose any more chickens." Caleb took the rifle from her, checked the chamber, and set it aside. "You did good," he said. She nodded, still looking at the coyote like she couldn't quite believe what she'd done. "I've never killed anything before," she said quietly. "It gets easier," Caleb said, then paused. "Not easier, just less strange." She met his eyes, and he saw something shift in her expression, an understanding maybe that this life was going to ask things of her she hadn't expected. "I'll bury it," he said. "I can help," she offered. "No need, you've done enough for one day." But she stayed anyway, watching as he dragged the coyote to the edge of the property and dug a shallow grave. When he finished, she was still there, her arms wrapped around herself despite the heat. "Caleb," she said. He looked up. "Thank you," she said, "for not making me feel foolish." He wiped the dirt from his hands and nodded. "You're not foolish," he said. "You're learning. There's a difference." The weeks turned into a month, and then 2. The garden began to flourish under Eliza's care, neat rows of vegetables pushing up through the soil. The chickens settled back into their routine, and the house started to feel less empty. Caleb found himself noticing things he hadn't before. The way Eliza hummed sometimes when she worked, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she was concentrating, the way she always left his coffee cup on the left side of the stove because that's where he reached for it. He didn't know what to do with those observations, so he filed them away and kept working. But one night, sitting across from her at the table, he realized something had changed. She wasn't a stranger anymore. She wasn't even just someone he'd taken in out of practicality. She was becoming something else, and that scared him more than he wanted to admit. The trouble started on a Saturday. Caleb had gone into town to drop off some eggs and pick up nails when he ran into Douglas Pharaoh. Pharaoh was a big man, broad-shouldered and loud, who owned the property to the north. He'd been trying to buy Caleb's land for over a year, and Caleb had turned him down every time. "Mercer," Pharaoh said, stepping into his path. "Heard you got yourself a woman out there." Caleb kept his expression neutral. "News travels." "She a wife?" Pharaoh asked, grinning. "She's a hired hand," Caleb said flatly. Pharaoh laughed, loud and ugly. "A hired hand? Right. You paying her in coin or something else?" Caleb's jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to it. "That's none of your business, Pharaoh." "Just saying," Pharaoh continued, leaning in. "If you're looking to sell, I'd offer you a fair price, especially now that you got someone to take care of." "I'm not selling." "Think about it," Pharaoh said, clapping him on the shoulder. "A man like you, with a woman like that, might be time to settle somewhere easier, somewhere safer." Caleb stepped back, shaking off his hand. "I said no." Pharaoh's smile faded, and his eyes went cold. "Suit yourself," he said. "But you're making things harder than they need to be, Mercer. This land's too much for one man. Eventually, you're going to figure that out." He walked away, and Caleb stood there, his hands clenched, watching him go. When he got back to the property, Eliza was at the well drawing water. She looked up when she heard the wagon, and he saw the question in her eyes. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Fine," he said shortly. But it wasn't fine. And as he unloaded the supplies, he couldn't shake the feeling that Pharaoh's words had planted something, some seed of doubt or danger that he couldn't quite name. Eliza didn't push, but that night, over dinner, she said, "If something's wrong, you can tell me." Caleb looked at her, surprised. "Why do you think something's wrong?" "Because you've been quiet all evening," she said. "Quieter than usual." He almost smiled at that. "Didn't know I was loud to begin with." "You're not," she said. "But you're different tonight." He set down his fork and rubbed his face. "Ran into a man in town," he admitted. "He's been trying to buy this place. I keep saying no, but he's not the kind who takes it well." Eliza's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened. "You think he'll cause trouble?" "I don't know," Caleb said honestly. "Maybe. Probably not. But I wanted you to know, just in case." She nodded slowly. "What would you do if he did?" "Depends on what kind of trouble," Caleb said. "But I'm not leaving. This land's mine, and I'm keeping it." Eliza looked at him for a long moment, and then she said very quietly, "Ours." Caleb blinked. "What?" "You said mine," she said. "But I work this land too, so it's ours." Something in his chest tightened, and he didn't know if it was fear or something else entirely. "Eliza," he said carefully, "you don't owe me that." "I know," she said, "but I'm saying it anyway." And just like that, the distance between them shifted again, closer, more solid, more real. Caleb didn't have words for it, so he just nodded. "All right," he said. "Ours." That word, ours, sat between them like something fragile. Caleb wasn't used to sharing, wasn't used to thinking beyond himself and the land and the work that never stopped. But Eliza had said it with such quiet certainty that he didn't know how to take it back, didn't even want to. The next morning, she was up before dawn again, and when he came out, she was already measuring flour for biscuits. "You sleep at all?" he asked, reaching for the coffee. "Enough," she said, not looking up. He watched her work, the way her hands moved quickly and precisely, the way she didn't waste a single motion. There was something almost fierce about it, like she was trying to prove something to herself as much as to him. "Eliza," he said. She glanced up. "You don't have to work yourself to the bone every day," he said. "You've earned your place here." She paused, her hands going still in the flour. "Have I?" she asked. "You know you have." She went back to mixing, but her shoulders had tensed. "I don't know that," she said quietly. "I don't know anything for certain anymore. I thought I knew things before I came here, and I was wrong about all of it." Caleb set down his cup and leaned against the counter, waiting. "I thought I was coming to a home," she continued, her voice steady but low. "I thought I'd have a husband, a place, something solid. And instead I got dust and a dead man's broken promise. So no, I don't assume anything. I work because that's the only thing I know how to do that matters." He didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. "All right," he said, "but you matter too, not just the work." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something passed between them that neither of them could name. "Thank you," she said finally. And that was the end of it. The days grew hotter as summer settled in fully. The sun turned the land into something harsh and unforgiving, and the work became a test of endurance. Caleb and Eliza fell into a partnership that felt more natural than anything he'd expected. She anticipated what he needed before he asked, and he found himself doing the same for her. They worked the garden together, planting late-season crops that might survive if they were lucky. They repaired the barn roof, patched the fence where it had started to sag, and cleared brush from the irrigation line that fed into the small creek running along the eastern edge of the property. She learned quickly. He showed her how to splice rope, how to read the sky for rain, how to gentle a spooked horse. She taught him things too, though she probably didn't realize it. How to make bread that didn't turn into a brick, how to keep the house cooler by opening certain windows at certain times, how to listen instead of just waiting for silence. One afternoon they were working on the fence line when Eliza stopped suddenly, her head tilted. "What?" Caleb asked. "Do you hear that?" He listened. At first he didn't hear anything unusual, just the wind moving through the scrub. Then he caught it, a low rhythmic sound coming from the north. Hooves. Several of them. He straightened, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle leaning against the fence post. "Get behind me," he said quietly. Eliza didn't argue. She moved to his left, close enough that he could feel her presence, but not so close that she'd be in the way if things went bad. 3 riders crested the low hill to the north, and Caleb's jaw tightened when he recognized the man in front. Douglas Pharaoh. Pharaoh rode down slowly, flanked by 2 men Caleb didn't recognize. They were rough-looking, the kind of hired muscle you didn't bring unless you were planning on making a point. Pharaoh reined in about 20 feet away and smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Mercer," he said. "Thought I'd ride out, see how you're managing." "Managing fine," Caleb said flatly. Pharaoh's gaze slid to Eliza, and Caleb felt his grip tighten on the rifle. "This the hired hand?" Pharaoh asked. "That's right," Caleb said. "Pretty thing," Pharaoh said, still looking at her. "Seems like a waste having her out here breaking her back on this dirt." Eliza met his gaze without flinching. "I'm standing right here," she said coolly. "If you've got something to say it to me." Pharaoh's smile widened, but there was something ugly underneath it. "Feisty," he said. "I like that." Caleb stepped forward, putting himself directly between Pharaoh and Eliza. "State your business, Pharaoh," he said, his voice low and hard. "Or get off my land." Pharaoh's smile faded. "Your land," he repeated. "That's the thing, Mercer. I've been thinking about that. This property's been in dispute before, you know. Old boundary lines, unclear deeds. It'd be a shame if someone decided to challenge your claim." Caleb's blood went cold, but he kept his face neutral. "My deed's clear," he said. "Filed and registered. You want to challenge it, take it up with the land office." "Maybe I will," Pharaoh said. "Or maybe you'll save us both the trouble and just sell. I'm offering you a fair price. More than fair, considering." "I'm not selling." Pharaoh leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes narrowing. "You're making a mistake," he said. "You and your hired hand out here alone. Accidents happen, Mercer. Fires, fence lines cut, livestock gone missing. It'd be a real shame if something like that happened. Caleb raised the rifle, not pointing it at Pharaoh, but making it clear it was ready. You threatening me? Pharaoh held up his hands, his expression mocking. Just making conversation, he said. Neighborly advice, that's all. He pulled his horse around and nodded to his men. Think about it, Mercer, he called over his shoulder, before things get harder than they need to be. They rode off, and Caleb stood there, watching until they disappeared over the hill. Only then did he lower the rifle, his hands shaking slightly. Eliza stepped up beside him, her face pale, but her voice steady. He's going to come back, she said. I know. What are you going to do? Caleb looked at her, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he saw fear in her eyes. Not fear of the land or the work or the isolation, fear of losing what they'd built. I'm going to fight, he said simply. How? He didn't have an answer for that yet, so he just shouldered the rifle and started walking back toward the house. We'll figure it out, he said, and she followed. That night, Caleb rode into Ridgewood. He didn't tell Eliza where he was going, just said he had business to take care of. She didn't ask, but he could see the worry in her eyes as he saddled his horse. The town was quiet when he arrived, the main street mostly empty except for a few men outside the saloon. Caleb tied off his horse and headed straight for the land office, a small building tucked between the general store and the blacksmith. The clerk, a thin man named Whitman, looked up when Caleb walked in. Mercer, he said, surprised. Bit late for business, isn't it? Need to check my deed, Caleb said. Make sure everything's in order. Whitman frowned but pulled out the ledger. He flipped through the pages, squinting in the lamplight, and then tapped a line. Here it is. Property registered to Caleb Mercer, dated 3 years back. Everything looks fine to me. Anyone been asking about it? Caleb asked. Whitman hesitated. Asking how? Challenging the boundaries, claiming disputes. Whitman closed the ledger slowly. Douglas Pharaoh was in here last week, he admitted. Wanted to see the old survey maps. Said he was checking his own property lines, but he spent a lot of time looking at yours. Caleb's stomach sank. Did you give him copies? Couldn't legally stop him, Whitman said. Maps are public record. Caleb swore under his breath. He's planning something, he said. Probably, Whitman agreed. But unless he can prove your deeds invalid, there's nothing he can do. And from what I've seen, your claim's solid. Caleb nodded, but he didn't feel reassured. Men like Pharaoh didn't need legal standing to cause trouble. They just needed opportunity. He left the land office and walked down to the saloon. He needed information, and the best place to get it was where men got drunk and careless with their words. Inside, the saloon was dimly lit and thick with smoke. Caleb ordered a whiskey and stood at the bar, listening. It didn't take long. 2 men at a corner table were talking, their voices low, but not low enough. Pharaoh's hiring again, one of them said. Offering good money for range work. Range work, the other repeated skeptically. That what he's calling it? That's what he said. But everyone knows he's pushing Mercer out. Been wanting that land for years. Mercer won't sell. Doesn't matter. Pharaoh's got patience. He'll wait him out, or he'll make him an offer he can't refuse. Caleb drained his whiskey and set the glass down hard enough that the men looked up. He met their eyes, held their gaze for a long moment, and then walked out. When he got back to the property, it was past midnight. The house was dark except for a single lamp burning in the kitchen window. He unsaddled his horse and went inside, expecting Eliza to be asleep. Instead, she was sitting at the table, a cup of cold tea in front of her. You waited up, he said. I couldn't sleep, she replied. He pulled out a chair and sat down, suddenly exhausted. Deed's solid, he said. Pharaoh's been sniffing around the land office, but there's nothing he can legally do. But he'll do something anyway, Eliza said. Yeah. She looked at him, her eyes steady in the lamplight. I meant what I said, she told him. This is our land. If you're staying, I'm staying. Eliza, shits. I'm not asking for permission, she interrupted. I'm telling you. I'm not running. Not from him, not from this. Caleb stared at her, and something in his chest cracked open, something he'd kept locked down for so long he'd forgotten it was there. You don't owe me that, he said quietly. I know, she said, but I'm giving it anyway. He didn't know what to say, so he just reached across the table and took her hand. Her fingers were calloused and rough from the work, and they fit perfectly in his. "All right," he said. "We stay." The trouble came 2 weeks later. Caleb woke in the middle of the night to the smell of smoke. He was on his feet before he was fully awake, pulling on his boots and grabbing the rifle. He burst out of his room and nearly collided with Eliza, who was already dressed, her face pale. "The barn," she said. He ran. The barn was on fire, flames licking up the side of the structure, spreading fast. The horses were screaming inside, panicked and trapped, and Caleb's heart lurched. "Get water!" he shouted to Eliza. She was already moving, running for the well. Caleb threw open the barn doors, smoke pouring out in a black wave. He covered his face with his sleeve and plunged inside. The heat was suffocating, the smoke so thick he could barely see. He stumbled toward the stalls, found the first horse, and fumbled with the latch. The animal bolted past him, nearly knocking him down. He moved to the second stall, got it open, and then the third. The cow was in the back, bellowing in terror. He reached her just as part of the roof collapsed behind him, sending sparks and burning wood crashing down. He got the cow loose, shoved her toward the door, and then ran. He made it out just as another section of the roof gave way. Eliza was there, throwing bucket after bucket of water on the flames, but it wasn't enough. The fire was too big, too fast. "Let it go," Caleb shouted, grabbing her arm. "It's gone." She pulled away, still throwing water, her face streaked with soot and tears. We can't stop it," he yelled. She finally stopped, her shoulders sagging, and they stood there together, watching the barn burn. By the time the fire burned itself out, there was nothing left but charred beams and ash. The horses and the cow had scattered into the dark, and Caleb could only hope they hadn't run too far. He sat down on the ground, his lungs burning, his hands blistered. Eliza sat beside him, silent. "This was Pharaoh," she said finally. "Yeah." "What are we going to do?" Caleb looked at the smoking ruins, his jaw tight. "We're going to rebuild," he said, "and then we're going to make sure he knows we're not going anywhere." The next morning, Caleb rode into town and went straight to the sheriff. The sheriff, a tired-looking man named Harper, listened to his story without much expression. "You got proof it was Pharaoh?" Harper asked. "No," Caleb admitted, "but he threatened me 2 weeks ago, told me accidents happen." Harper sighed. "Threats aren't proof, Mercer. Unless you saw someone set the fire, there's not much I can do." "So he can just burn me out and walk away?" "I didn't say that," Harper said. "I'll ride out, talk to him. But without evidence, my hands are tied." Caleb left the sheriff's office, his frustration simmering. He knew Harper wasn't wrong, he just didn't care. The law was supposed to protect people, but out here, it barely existed. When he got back to the property, Eliza was standing in the ruins of the barn, a shovel in her hands. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Clearing the debris," she said. "We need to start rebuilding." He dismounted and walked over to her. "Eliza, we don't have the money for lumber right now. We need to rebuild," she interrupted, her voice hard. "Because if we don't, he wins. And I'm not letting him win." Caleb looked at her, this woman who'd arrived with nothing, who'd been abandoned and left for dead, who was now standing in the ashes of their barn with a shovel and a look of absolute determination. "All right," he said. "We rebuild." They spent the next 2 days clearing the site. It was brutal work, hauling away charred wood, pulling nails from half-burned beams, sorting through what could be salvaged. Caleb's hands were raw, his back aching, but Eliza never complained. She worked beside him, matching him hour for hour. On the third day, a wagon rolled up the road. Caleb looked up, ready to grab the rifle, but then he recognized the driver. It was Tom Ashford, a rancher from the next valley over. Caleb had helped him out a few years back when his well had run dry, and they'd stayed on good terms. Tom climbed down from the wagon, took one look at the barn, and swore. "Heard what happened," he said. "Figured you could use some help." Behind him, 2 more wagons appeared, carrying lumber and supplies. And behind them, a handful of men Caleb recognized from town. Neighbors, ranchers, men who'd heard what Pharaoh had done and decided to take a side. Caleb didn't know what to say. "We don't have much to pay you with," he managed. Tom waved him off. "Not asking for payment, just doing what's right." Eliza appeared beside Caleb, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at the wagons, at the men, and then at Tom. "Thank you," she said quietly. Tom tipped his hat. "Ma'am?" And just like that, the rebuilding began. Over the next week, the new barn took shape. It wasn't as big as the old one, but it was solid. The men worked together, their voices filling the air. And for the first time since the fire, Caleb felt something other than anger. He felt hope. Eliza kept the workers fed, somehow stretching their meager supplies into meals that kept everyone going. She brewed coffee, baked bread, and moved among the men with quiet efficiency. They respected her, Caleb noticed. They didn't talk down to her or treat her like she didn't belong. They treated her like she was part of this. Because she was. One evening, after the workers had left for the day, Caleb found her sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the half-finished barn. "You all right?" he asked. "I keep thinking about what you said," she replied, "about this being ours." He sat down beside her. "What about it?" "I didn't believe it at first," she admitted. "I thought it was just something you said to make me feel better. But watching all those people come together, seeing what we're building, I think I believe it now." Caleb didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at her in the fading light. "It is ours," he said finally. "I wouldn't want it any other way." She turned to him, her eyes searching his face. "I don't know what happens next," she said. "Pharaoh's not going to stop. He's going to keep pushing." "I know. And you're still staying." "We're still staying," he corrected. She smiled then, small but real. "Yeah," she said. "We are." The barn was finished on a Sunday. The men gathered to admire their work, and Tom Ashford clapped Caleb on the shoulder. "Good as new," he said. "Better," Caleb replied. Tom glanced at Eliza, who was standing by the door, and lowered his voice. "She's a good woman, Mercer. Don't let her go." "I won't," Caleb said. That night, after everyone had left, Caleb and Eliza stood together in the new barn. It smelled of fresh wood and possibility. "Feels different," Eliza said. "It is different," Caleb agreed. "We built this one together." She looked at him, and he saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen before, something soft and unguarded. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah? I'm glad I stayed." He reached out and took her hand, the same way he had that night at the kitchen table. "So am I," he said. And for the first time since she'd arrived, the distance between them disappeared completely. They stood there in the quiet of the new barn, hands linked, and Caleb realized he'd been holding his breath. He let it out slowly, feeling the weight of something shift inside him, something he'd been carrying alone for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to share it. Eliza's fingers tightened around his, just slightly, and then she stepped back, breaking the contact. But her expression had changed. The careful distance she'd maintained since the day she arrived had softened, and in its place was something warmer, something that felt like trust. "We should get some rest," she said. "Tomorrow's going to be another long day." Caleb nodded, though he wasn't sure he'd be able to sleep. His mind was already turning over what came next. The work that still needed doing, the threat that still hung over them, the fact that Pharaoh hadn't made another move yet but would. Men like him always did. They walked back to the house together, the night air cool against their skin. At the door, Eliza paused. "Caleb?" "Yeah?" "Thank you for letting me fight with you," she said, "instead of trying to protect me from it." He looked at her, surprised. "You earned that right the day you shot that coyote." She smiled, just a little. "Maybe, but not everyone would have seen it that way." "Well," he said, "I'm not everyone." "No," she agreed. "You're not." She went inside, and he stood there on the porch for a while longer, looking out at the dark shapes of the land he'd claimed, the barn they'd rebuilt, the life they were carving out of this unforgiving place. It felt fragile, but it also felt real. The next 2 weeks passed in a kind of quiet intensity. Caleb and Eliza worked the land with renewed focus, preparing for the fall harvest, shoring up the fences, making sure the irrigation held. The garden was thriving despite the heat, and the chickens had settled back into a reliable rhythm of laying. The horses had come back on their own, nervous but unharmed, and the cow had been found grazing near the creek. Everything had returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the tension underneath hadn't gone away. It was there in the way Caleb checked the horizon more often, in the way Eliza kept the rifle within reach when she worked outside. Pharaoh hadn't shown his face again, but his presence lingered like smoke. One afternoon, Caleb was repairing a broken spoke on the wagon wheel when he heard hoofbeats coming fast. He grabbed the rifle and stood, shading his eyes against the sun. It was Tom Ashford, riding hard. He pulled up in a cloud of dust, his face grim. "Mercer," he said, breathing hard. "We got a problem." Caleb's stomach dropped. "What kind of problem?" "Pharaoh's filed a complaint with the territorial surveyor," Tom said. "Claims your northern boundary line's been drawn wrong. Says you're sitting on 20 acres that belong to him." Caleb swore. "That's a lie. The deed's clear." "I know it is," Tom said, "but he's got a surveyor coming out next week to remeasure, and he's paying him well enough that I don't trust what he's going to find." Eliza appeared from the garden, wiping her hands on her apron. She'd heard Tom's voice and came quickly, her face tight with worry. "What's happening?" she asked. Caleb told her, and he watched her expression harden. "Can he do that?" she asked Tom. Just bring in his own surveyor?" "Technically, yes," Tom said. "If there's a dispute, either party can request a new survey. The problem is Pharaoh's got money and connections. He can make this drag out for months, maybe years, and in the meantime, he'll make your life hell." Caleb felt the anger rising in his chest, hot and tight. This was exactly what Pharaoh wanted. To tie him up in legal battles he couldn't afford, to wear him down until selling seemed like the only option. "What do we do?" Eliza asked quietly. Caleb looked at her, then at Tom. "We fight it. We get our own surveyor out here, prove the boundary's right where it's supposed to be." "That'll cost money," Tom said gently. "I know." "You got that kind of money?" Caleb didn't answer right away. He didn't, not really. He had enough saved to get through the winter if the harvest was good, but hiring a surveyor would wipe that out. "We'll find it," Eliza said firmly. Tom looked between them, then nodded. "All right, I know a surveyor over in Cedar Falls named Patterson. He's honest, won't be bought. I can send word, see if he'll come out." "Do it," Caleb said. "And Tom, thank you." Tom tipped his hat. "We look after our own out here, Mercer. You're not in this alone." He rode off, and Caleb stood there, staring at the dust settling in the road. "We're going to lose everything we saved," he said quietly. "Maybe," Eliza said, "but if we don't fight, we lose the land, and I'd rather be broke with a home than comfortable with nothing." He turned to look at her, and once again he was struck by the sheer stubbornness in her. She'd been knocked down hard by life, left with nothing, and somehow she'd decided that nothing was worth fighting for. "You're something else, you know that?" he said. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "So are you." Patterson arrived 5 days later, a wiry man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner. He spent 2 full days surveying the property, walking the boundary lines with his instruments, checking markers, cross-referencing old maps. Caleb and Eliza trailed behind him, waiting. The tension was unbearable. Every time Patterson frowned or made a note in his book, Caleb's stomach twisted. Finally, on the evening of the second day, Patterson came back to the house and spread his maps out on the kitchen table. "All right," he said. "Here's what I found." Caleb and Eliza leaned in. "Your northern boundary is exactly where it's supposed to be," Patterson said, tapping the map. "The original survey was accurate. There's no encroachment, no dispute. Pharaoh doesn't have a leg to stand on." Caleb felt the breath leave his body in a rush. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," Patterson said. "I've got the measurements, the documentation, everything you'll need if this goes to court. Your deed is solid." Eliza's hand found Caleb's under the table, and he squeezed it hard. "Thank you," Caleb said. Patterson nodded. "Just doing my job. But I'll tell you this, Pharaoh's not going to like it. Men like him don't handle losing well." "I know," Caleb said grimly. Patterson packed up his instruments and left the next morning. Caleb paid him what they'd agreed on, watching a significant portion of their savings disappear, but it was worth it. They had proof now, legal, documented proof that the land was theirs. But Patterson's warning stuck with him. Pharaoh wasn't done, not by a long shot. The confrontation came 3 days later. Caleb was in town picking up supplies when Pharaoh cornered him outside the general store. He had 2 men with him, the same ones from before, and they spread out in a way that made it clear Caleb wasn't leaving until Pharaoh had his say. "Heard you brought in a surveyor," Pharaoh said, his voice casual but his eyes cold. "That's right," Caleb said evenly. And the boundary's exactly where it's supposed to be. Your claim's got no merit." Pharaoh's jaw tightened. "That's so." "It is." Pharaoh stepped closer, close enough that Caleb could smell the whiskey on his breath. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Mercer," he said quietly. "I've been patient. I've been reasonable. But my patience has limits." "So does mine," Caleb said. "You got that woman out there with you?" Pharaoh continued, his voice dropping lower. "A lot of things can happen to a woman alone on a property. Accidents, misunderstandings. Be a real shame if something happened to her while you were in town." The rage that flooded through Caleb was instant and white-hot. He didn't think, he just moved. His fist connected with Pharaoh's jaw with a crack that echoed down the street, and Pharaoh stumbled back, blood already welling at the corner of his mouth. Pharaoh's men moved in, but Sheriff Harper appeared from nowhere, his hand on his gun. "That's enough," Harper said sharply. Pharaoh spat blood onto the dirt, his eyes blazing. "You saw that, Harper. He assaulted me." "I saw you threaten him first," Harper said calmly, "and I heard what you said about his hired hand. You keep pushing, Pharaoh, and I'll have to consider that harassment." Pharaoh wiped his mouth, his gaze locked on Caleb. "This isn't over," he said. "No," Caleb agreed. "It's not." Pharaoh and his men left, and Harper turned to Caleb. "You need to be careful," Harper said quietly. "He's got resources you don't, and he's not afraid to use them." "I know," Caleb said. "Then watch your back, and watch hers." Caleb nodded and headed home, his knuckles aching, his mind racing. He'd crossed a line today, and he knew it, but he didn't regret it. The moment Pharaoh had threatened Eliza, the choice had been made. When he got back to the property, Eliza took one look at his bruised hand and went pale. "What happened?" He told her, leaving nothing out. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "He threatened me," she said finally. "Yeah." "Because he knows it'll get to you." "Yeah." She looked at him, her eyes fierce. "I'm not afraid of him, Caleb. I've faced worse than Douglas Pharaoh." "I know you have," he said. "But I am. I'm afraid of what he might do." She crossed the room and stood in front of him, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her eyes. "Then we'll face it together," she said, "just like everything else." He wanted to argue, wanted to tell her to leave, to go somewhere safe where men like Pharaoh couldn't touch her, but he knew she wouldn't go. She'd made her choice, just like he had. "All right," he said. "Together." The next few weeks were tense. Caleb and Eliza stayed on high alert, keeping the rifle close, watching for any sign of trouble. They worked quickly, efficiently, always within sight of each other. At night, Caleb found himself lying awake, listening to every sound, ready to move at the first hint of danger. But nothing happened. The silence was almost worse than an attack would have been, because it meant Pharaoh was planning something. Men like him didn't make threats and then walk away. In the meantime, life went on. The harvest came in better than expected, the garden yielding enough vegetables to can for the winter. Eliza worked tirelessly, preserving everything she could, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. Caleb watched her sometimes when she didn't know he was looking. She'd changed since that first day, stronger, surer of herself. But there was something else too, something softer in the way she looked at him now, in the way she touched his shoulder when she passed, in the way she smiled when she thought he wasn't watching. One evening, after they'd finished canning the last of the tomatoes, they sat on the porch together, exhausted but satisfied. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. "I've been thinking," Eliza said. "About?" "About what happens if we win," she said. "If we get through this, if Pharaoh finally gives up, what then?" Caleb looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what are we doing here?" she asked. "Are we just surviving, or are we building something more?" It was a fair question, and one he'd been avoiding asking himself. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've been so focused on keeping this place that I haven't thought much beyond that." She nodded slowly. "I think we should." "Should what?" "Think beyond it," she said. "Because I don't want to just survive, Caleb. I want to build something that lasts, something that matters." He looked out at the land, at the barn they'd rebuilt, at the garden that was thriving despite everything. "What did you have in mind?" he asked. I don't know yet, she said, but I think we should figure it out. Together. There was that word again. Together. It had become the foundation of everything they were building, and hearing her say it made something in his chest ache in a way that wasn't entirely unpleasant. All right, he said. We'll figure it out. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture so simple and natural it took his breath away. He sat very still, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever this was. Caleb? She said softly. Yeah? I'm glad I ended up here. With you. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. So am I, he said. They sat there as the sun disappeared below the horizon, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Caleb felt something close to peace. The peace lasted exactly 3 more days. Caleb was checking the irrigation line when he heard the sound of wagons, not one, but several, coming from the north. He straightened, shading his eyes, and felt his stomach drop. It was Pharaoh. And he'd brought an entire crew with him. Caleb ran back to the house, shouting for Eliza. She appeared in the doorway, saw his face, and grabbed the rifle without being told. By the time Pharaoh's wagons rolled into the yard, Caleb and Eliza were standing side by side on the porch, armed and ready. Pharaoh climbed down from the lead wagon, and Caleb counted at least a dozen men with him, hired hands, by the look of them, rough and ready for trouble. Mercer, Pharaoh called out, we need to talk. Talk from there, Caleb said, his hand on his rifle. Pharaoh spread his hands, the picture of reasonableness. I'm here in an official capacity. Got a court order here that says I have the right to inspect the disputed boundary. There is no disputed boundary, Caleb said. Patterson's survey proved that. Patterson's survey, Pharaoh repeated. See, that's the thing. I've got my own surveyor here, and he's got some questions about Patterson's methods. Judge agreed that a second opinion was warranted. Caleb's blood ran cold. What judge? Pharaoh pulled a paper from his coat and held it up. Judge Morrison, out of the territorial court. All legal and proper. Morrison's in your pocket, Caleb said flatly. Pharaoh smiled. Careful, Mercer. That's slander. Caleb looked at the paper, at the men, at Pharaoh's smug expression, and knew he was trapped. If he refused to let them on the property, he'd be in contempt of court. But if he let them in, Pharaoh would find a way to twist the survey, to claim the land, to take everything they'd fought for. Eliza's voice was quiet beside him. What do we do? I don't know, he admitted. Pharaoh was waiting, watching them with barely concealed satisfaction. You've got 1 hour, Caleb said finally. Your surveyor can measure whatever he wants, but I'm watching every step, and if I see anything that looks like tampering, I'm filing my own complaint. Wouldn't have it any other way, Pharaoh said smoothly. He gestured to his surveyor, a weaselly-looking man with thinning hair, and they started toward the northern boundary. Caleb followed, with Eliza right behind him. The survey took the full hour, and Caleb watched like a hawk. The surveyor made a show of checking markers, taking measurements, consulting maps. But Caleb could see the way he kept glancing at Pharaoh, the way his notes seemed to shift depending on what Pharaoh wanted. When they finished, the surveyor came back to where Pharaoh was waiting. Well? Pharaoh asked. The surveyor cleared his throat. Based on my measurements, there appears to be a discrepancy of approximately 18 acres. The northern boundary marker has shifted over time, likely due to erosion. The original property line should be farther south. That's a lie, Caleb said immediately. The surveyor bristled. I'm a licensed professional. You're a bot man, Caleb interrupted. Patterson's survey was done 3 days ago. The markers haven't moved. Pharaoh stepped forward. You calling my surveyor a liar, Mercer? I'm calling him what he is, Caleb said. And I'm calling you a thief. The air went very still. Pharaoh's men shifted, hands moving toward their guns. Eliza raised her rifle, and Caleb did the same. You're making a mistake, Pharaoh said quietly. No, Caleb said. You are. Because I'm not backing down. Not now, not ever. You want this land? You're going to have to kill me for it. Pharaoh's eyes narrowed. That can be arranged. Try it, Eliza said, her voice steady despite the rifle shaking slightly in her hands. And you'll have to go through both of us. Pharaoh looked at her, really looked at her, and something like surprise crossed his face. Then he laughed, short and ugly. You've got spirit, I'll give you that, he said. But spirit doesn't win land disputes. Money does. And I've got more of it than you'll ever see. He turned and started walking back to his wagon. You'll be hearing from my lawyers, Mercer. And when the court rules in my favor, you'll have 30 days to vacate. Enjoy your last month on my property. The wagons pulled away, and Caleb and Eliza stood there, watching them go. When the dust finally settled, Eliza lowered the rifle, her hands shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. What do we do now? She asked. Caleb looked at the land, at the house, at everything they'd built. We fight, he said, however we can. That night, Caleb rode back into town and went straight to Tom Ashford's place. Tom listened to the whole story, his expression growing darker with every word. Morrison's crooked as they come, Tom said when Caleb finished. Everyone knows it, but no one can prove it. He's been taking Pharaoh's money for years. Then how do we beat him? Caleb asked. Tom was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Then he leaned forward. You need a lawyer, he said. A good one. Someone who can challenge the survey, expose Morrison's bias, maybe even get the case moved to a different court. I can't afford a lawyer, Caleb said. Maybe you don't have to, Tom said. There's a man over in Cedar Falls, named William Garrett. He used to practice law back east, moved out here a few years ago. He takes cases sometimes, pro bono, if he thinks they're worth fighting. Why would he think mine is? Because he hates corruption, Tom said. And he hates men like Pharaoh even more. It's worth a try. Caleb nodded slowly. How do I reach him? I'll send word, Tom said. Tell him what's happening. But Mercer, even with a good lawyer, this is going to be an uphill fight. You need to be prepared for that. I am, Caleb said. But as he rode home under the stars, he wasn't sure if that was true. He was prepared to fight, yes, prepared to lose everything trying. What he wasn't prepared for was the possibility that it might not be enough. William Garrett arrived a week later. He was younger than Caleb expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes and a deliberate way of speaking that made everything he said sound important. He sat at their kitchen table, reviewing Patterson's survey, the court order, and Caleb's account of what had happened. Eliza made coffee and sat with them, listening. When Garrett finally looked up, his expression was grim. This is bad, he said bluntly. Morrison's order is legally binding and Pharaoh's surveyor is licensed. Even if we can prove the survey's fraudulent, it's going to take time, and time is something you don't have. How long? Caleb asked. Months, Garrett said. Maybe longer. And in the meantime, Pharaoh can file for an injunction, prevent you from working the land, claim damages. He can bleed you dry before this ever sees a courtroom. Eliza's face had gone pale. So what do we do? Garrett drummed his fingers on the table, thinking. We go on the offensive, he said finally. We don't wait for him to drag you through the courts. We file our own suit, fraud, harassment, maybe even attempted arson if we can tie that barn fire to him. We make this messy enough that even Morrison has to think twice about ruling in Pharaoh's favor. Can we win? Caleb asked. Garrett met his eyes. Honestly, I don't know, but I think we can make him bleed too, and sometimes that's enough. Caleb looked at Eliza. She looked back, and he saw his own determination reflected in her eyes. Do it, Caleb said. Garrett nodded. All right, I'll need sworn statements from both of you, copies of everything you've got. Deeds, surveys, receipts, and I'll need you to be ready for this to get worse before it gets better. We're ready, Eliza said. Garrett gathered his papers and stood. I'll be in touch. And Mercer, watch your back. Men like Pharaoh don't like being challenged. He's going to push harder now. Let him, Caleb said. After Garrett left, Caleb and Eliza sat in the quiet of the kitchen, the weight of what they'd just committed to settling over them. Are we doing the right thing? Eliza asked quietly. I don't know, Caleb admitted, but it's the only thing we can do. She reached across the table and took his hand. Then we'll see it through, she said. Together. And somehow, with her hand in his, the impossible felt just a little bit more possible. The days after Garrett's visit felt like waiting for a storm that kept promising to break, but never did. Caleb worked the land with a kind of grim determination, fixing things that didn't need fixing, checking fences that were already secure. He couldn't sit still. Every time he stopped moving, his mind went to places he didn't want it to go. Losing the land, losing everything they'd built, watching Eliza walk away because he'd failed to protect what mattered, She noticed, of course. She always noticed. "You're going to wear yourself out," she said one afternoon, finding him replacing boards on the chicken coop that were perfectly fine. "Keeps me busy," he said, not looking up. "Busy isn't the same as useful." He stopped, hammer in hand, and finally met her eyes. She was standing there with her arms crossed, her hair pulled back in a braid that had started to come loose, dirt smudged on her cheek. She looked tired. They both were. "I don't know what else to do," he admitted. "We filed the suit. We've got Garrett working on it. But it feels like we're just waiting for Pharaoh to make the next move." "So we wait," she said, "and we keep living. That's all we can do." "What if it's not enough?" She came closer, her expression softening. "Then it's not enough. But sitting here tearing yourself apart worrying about it won't change anything." He set the hammer down and rubbed his face. "I just keep thinking, what if I've made this worse? What if going after him legally just makes him more determined to destroy us?" "Maybe it does," Eliza said, "but you gave us a fighting chance. That's more than we had before." He wanted to believe her. He wanted to feel the certainty she seemed to carry so easily. But all he felt was the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, heavier every day. "Come on," she said, taking his hand. "Let's go inside. I made stew." He let her pull him toward the house, her hand warm in his, and tried to push the worry aside. Just for a little while. 2 weeks later, Garrett sent word that the hearing was scheduled. It would take place in front of Judge Morrison, which was exactly what they'd expected and exactly what they'd feared. Garrett had filed motions to have the case moved to a different court, arguing Morrison's bias, but they'd been denied. They were stuck with a judge who was already in Pharaoh's pocket. "So what's the plan?" Caleb asked when Garrett rode out to discuss strategy. Garrett spread his notes out on the table. "We attack the credibility of Pharaoh's survey. I've got Patterson ready to testify, and I've dug up some information on Pharaoh's surveyor. Turns out he's been involved in 3 other disputed boundary cases in the last 2 years, and in every single one, his findings favored whoever paid him." "That's not coincidence," Eliza said. "No, it's not," Garrett agreed. "But proving corruption and getting a judge to acknowledge it are 2 different things. Morrison's going to try to shut this down fast. He'll claim the survey speaks for itself, that Patterson's just one opinion against another." "Then what do we do?" Caleb asked. "We make noise," Garrett said. "We call witnesses. Everyone who helped rebuild that barn. Everyone who saw Pharaoh threaten you. We turn this into more than just a boundary dispute. We make it about character, about who deserves to own this land." Caleb frowned. "That's not how the law works." "The law is supposed to be about justice," Garrett said. "But out here, it's about who can tell the better story. And we've got a good one. Hard-working rancher defending his land against a wealthy bully who's trying to steal it. That plays well, even with a crooked judge." Eliza looked skeptical. "You really think Morrison cares about any of that?" "No," Garrett admitted, "but the people watching do. Morrison knows if he rules too obviously in Pharaoh's favor, word spreads. People talk, and even corrupt judges care about their reputations." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all they had. The hearing was set for 3 weeks out. Garrett spent that time gathering testimony, building their case. Caleb and Eliza tried to keep working, but the waiting gnawed at them. Every day felt like holding their breath. One night, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, Caleb heard Eliza moving around in her room. He got up, pulled on his shirt, and knocked softly on her door. "You awake?" he asked. "Yeah." He opened the door. She was sitting by the window, wrapped in a blanket, looking out at the dark. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "No." He came in and sat on the edge of her bed. "Me neither." They were quiet for a moment, just sitting together in the dark. "Caleb?" she said finally. "Yeah? What happens if we lose?" He'd been avoiding that question, but now it hung between them, unavoidable. "I don't know," he said honestly. "We'd have to leave, find somewhere else." "Together?" she asked, her voice small. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the fear there, not of losing the land, but of losing what they'd become. "If you'll have me," he said quietly. She turned away from the window and met his eyes. "That's not the question." "Then what is?" "Whether you want me," she said. "Not because I'm useful, not because I work hard, but just me." His throat tightened. He'd been so focused on keeping the land, on fighting Pharaoh, that he hadn't let himself think about what he actually wanted. But sitting here in the dark with her, the answer was suddenly painfully clear. "I want you," he said, his voice rough. "I've wanted you for a while now. I just didn't know how to say it." Her eyes glistened, and she reached out, taking his hand. "I want you too," she whispered. He moved closer, cupping her face in his hands, and kissed her. It was gentle at first, careful, like they were both afraid of breaking something. But then she leaned into him, her hands fisting in his shirt, and the kiss deepened into something that felt like a promise. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "Whatever happens," he said, "we face it together. You and me." "You and me," she repeated. He stayed with her that night, just holding her while she slept. And for the first time in weeks, the knot in his chest loosened just enough to let him breathe. The day of the hearing arrived cold and gray, the sky threatening rain. Caleb and Eliza dressed carefully, him in his best shirt and pants, her in a simple dress she'd mended so many times the seams were nearly invisible. They rode into town together in the wagon, neither of them saying much. The courthouse was a small building on the main street, already crowded when they arrived. Word had spread, and it seemed like half the county had shown up to watch. Caleb saw Tom Ashford and the men who'd helped rebuild the barn, saw shopkeepers and ranchers and people he barely knew. And he saw Pharaoh, standing with his lawyer and his hired surveyor, looking confident and well-rested. Garrett met them at the door. "You ready?" "As we'll ever be," Caleb said. "Remember, let me do the talking. If Morrison asks you a direct question, answer it straight and simple. Don't let Pharaoh's lawyer bait you." They went inside. The courtroom was small and stuffy, the wooden benches packed with spectators. Judge Morrison sat at the front, a heavy-set man with a florid face and eyes that barely looked up when they entered. The hearing began with Pharaoh's lawyer presenting their case. He was smooth, practiced, laying out the boundary dispute like it was the most straightforward thing in the world. He called Pharaoh's surveyor to the stand, and the man testified about discrepancies and shifted markers and 18 acres that rightfully belonged to Pharaoh. Garrett cross-examined him hard, pressing him on his methodology, his credentials, his past cases. The surveyor got defensive, started contradicting himself, but Morrison cut Garrett off before he could push too far. "Move along, counselor," Morrison said. "We've heard enough." Then it was their turn. Garrett called Patterson first. Patterson walked through his survey step by step, presenting maps and measurements, explaining why the original boundary was correct and why Pharaoh's surveyor was wrong. "And you're certain of these findings?" Garrett asked. "Absolutely certain," Patterson said. "The markers are original, undisturbed. There's no discrepancy." Pharaoh's lawyer stood to cross-examine. "Mr. Patterson, isn't it true that you were paid by the defendant to conduct this survey?" "I was paid for my time, yes," Patterson said, "just like your surveyor was paid by Mr. Pharaoh." "And isn't it possible that your findings were influenced by who was paying you?" Patterson's eyes narrowed. "I've been a surveyor for 30 years. My reputation is built on accuracy, not on who signs my checks. If you're suggesting otherwise, you'd better have proof." Pharaoh's lawyer smiled. No further questions. Garrett called Tom Ashford next, and Tom testified about Pharaoh's threats, about the barn fire, about the general harassment Caleb had endured. Then he called 3 other ranchers who'd witnessed Pharaoh's intimidation tactics over the years. Morrison looked bored through all of it, occasionally checking his pocket watch. Finally, Garrett called Caleb to the stand. Caleb walked up, put his hand on the Bible for the oath, and sat down. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Garrett led him through the basics, how long he'd owned the land, how he'd acquired it, what improvements he'd made. Then Garrett asked about Pharaoh's threats. "He told me accidents happen," Caleb said, keeping his voice steady. "Said it'd be a shame if something happened to Miss Hartwell while I was in town." "And did something happen?" Garrett asked. "Our barn burned down 3 days later." "Do you have proof Mr. Pharaoh was involved?" "No direct proof," Caleb admitted, "but the timing's hard to ignore." Pharaoh's lawyer stood. "Objection. Speculation." Morrison nodded. "Sustained. Stick to facts, Mr. Mercer." Garrett continued, asking about the property, about the work they'd done, about why this land mattered. Caleb answered as best he could, trying to convey what he felt without sounding desperate. Then Pharaoh's lawyer stood to cross-examine. Mr. Mercer, he said smoothly, you've put a lot of work into this property, haven't you? Yes. Must be exhausting, especially for just one man. I'm not alone, Caleb said. Miss Hartwell works the land with me.
Ah, yes, Miss Hartwell, the lawyer said. The woman you hired. Tell me, what exactly is her role here? Caleb's jaw tightened. She's my partner. Your partner, the lawyer repeated. In what capacity? In every capacity, Caleb said firmly. The lawyer smiled. I see. And when exactly did this partnership begin? Before or after you realized you might lose the land? Garrett stood. Objection. Relevance. I'm establishing the defendant's motivations, Your Honor, the lawyer said.
Morrison waved his hand. I'll allow it. Answer the question, Mr. Mercer. Caleb took a breath. Miss Hartwell came to my property 4 months ago. She's worked beside me every day since. We're partners because that's what we've built together. The timeline doesn't change that. But it's convenient, isn't it? The lawyer pressed. A woman suddenly appearing, helping you work the land, making you look more sympathetic to the court. That's not what this is, Caleb said, his anger rising. Then what is it? Caleb looked at Eliza, sitting in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes met his, and he saw everything he needed to see. It's the truth, he said quietly. She stayed because she wanted to. And I'm fighting for this land because it's ours, both of ours. The lawyer opened his mouth to ask another question, but Morrison cut him off. That's enough, Morrison said. Mr. Mercer, you may step down. Caleb returned to his seat, his hands shaking. Eliza reached over and squeezed his arm. Garrett called Eliza to the stand last. She walked up calmly, took the oath, and sat down. Caleb had never been more proud of her. Garrett asked her about her arrival, about the work she'd done, about why she'd stayed. She answered clearly, without embellishment, her voice steady. Miss Hartwell, Garrett said, why do you think Mr. Pharaoh is trying to take this land? Because he wants it, she said simply. And he's used to getting what he wants. And why should he not get it? Because it's not his, she said. It belongs to the person who's worked it, who's cared for it, who's bled for it. And that's Caleb. Not you? Garrett asked. She paused, then smiled faintly. Us. It belongs to us. Pharaoh's lawyer declined to cross-examine, and Morrison called for closing arguments. Garrett stood and made his case. Patterson's survey was accurate. Pharaoh's was fraudulent. The harassment was clear. The claim was baseless. He spoke with passion, with conviction, and when he finished, the courtroom was silent. Pharaoh's lawyer stood and made his counter-argument. The survey was legitimate, the boundary was in dispute, Mercer's claim was questionable at best. He was smooth, confident, and when he sat down, Morrison looked unmoved. Morrison shuffled his papers, cleared his throat, and looked up. I've heard both sides, he said, and I find that the evidence is inconclusive. However, given the seriousness of the boundary dispute, I'm ordering a third survey to be conducted by a court-appointed surveyor. Until that survey is completed and the results are presented, the northern 18 acres of the disputed property will be held in trust, with neither party permitted to work or develop them. Caleb's stomach dropped. That was half his best grazing land. Garrett stood. Your Honor, that's... Morrison slammed his gavel. My decision is final. Court is adjourned. He stood and left, and the courtroom erupted in murmurs. Caleb sat there, numb, trying to process what had just happened. They hadn't lost, but they hadn't won either, and Pharaoh was smiling. Outside the courthouse, Garrett pulled them aside. This is a delay tactic, he said. Morrison's buying Pharaoh time to figure out his next move. What do we do? Eliza asked. We wait for the third survey, Garrett said, and we hope the court-appointed surveyor is honest. It's the best we can do for now. Caleb felt the anger building in his chest, hot and bitter. So we just sit there while Pharaoh does whatever he wants? No, Garrett said. We keep fighting. We file appeals. We push back on every delay. We make this as difficult for him as possible. But Mercer, this is going to take time. You need to be prepared for that. Caleb wanted to punch something. He wanted to burn the whole courthouse down, but instead he just nodded. Garrett left, and Caleb and Eliza stood there on the courthouse steps, watching the crowd disperse. Tom Ashford came over, clapping Caleb on the shoulder. "You did good in there." "Didn't feel like it," Caleb said. "You told the truth," Tom said. "That counts for something." After Tom left, Caleb and Eliza walked to the wagon in silence. They climbed up, and Caleb took the reins, but he didn't move. "What are you thinking?" Eliza asked. "I'm thinking I should have just sold when he first asked," Caleb said bitterly. "Would have saved us all this trouble." "No," Eliza said firmly. "You'd have saved yourself the trouble, but you'd have lost everything that matters." He looked at her. "The land?" "Us," she said. "If you'd sold, I'd have left, found work somewhere else. We never would have had this." She gestured between them, and Caleb felt the weight of that truth settle over him. "You're right," he said quietly. "I know you're right. I'm just tired of fighting." "Then rest," she said. "But don't give up." He reached over and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I won't," he said. "Not while you're with me." She leaned against his shoulder and they sat there for a while, just holding on to each other while the town moved around them. Finally, Caleb flicked the reins and they headed home. The weeks after the hearing were strange. The court-appointed surveyor came out, did his work, and left without saying much. Caleb and Eliza couldn't work the disputed acres, which meant they had to shift their plans for the fall planting, had to reorganize everything they'd been building toward. It was frustrating, maddening even. But something else had shifted too. The night after the hearing, Caleb had asked Eliza if she'd marry him. It wasn't romantic. There were no flowers, no grand gestures. They were sitting at the kitchen table, exhausted and worried, and he just looked at her and said, "We should make this official." She'd laughed, tired and a little broken. "That's the worst proposal I've ever heard." "Probably," he'd admitted, "but I mean it. I want you here. Not as a hired hand, not as a partner, as my wife." She'd gone quiet then, her eyes searching his face. "You're sure?" she'd asked. "I've never been more sure of anything." She'd said yes. They didn't have a big ceremony. They rode into town the next week and stood in front of a justice of the peace with Tom Ashford and his wife as witnesses. Caleb wore the same shirt he'd worn to the hearing. Eliza wore her mended dress. They said their vows in less than 5 minutes. But when the justice pronounced them married and Caleb kissed her, it felt more real than anything else in his life ever had. Afterward, they went to the general store and bought supplies, and the clerk congratulated them with genuine warmth. Word spread fast, as it always did in small towns, and by the time they got home, they'd been stopped half a dozen times by people offering their best wishes. That night, Eliza moved her things into Caleb's room. It wasn't a big move, she didn't have much, but seeing her clothes hanging next to his, her brush on the dresser beside his shaving kit, made the house feel different, complete, somehow. They lay in bed together, her head on his chest, his arm around her shoulders. "Do you think this changes anything?" she asked. "With the case, I mean." "I don't know," Caleb said. "Maybe. Maybe it just makes us harder to separate." "Good," she said, "because I'm not going anywhere." He kissed the top of her head. "Neither am I." The third survey results came back 6 weeks later. The surveyor found exactly what Patterson had found. The boundary was correct. There was no discrepancy. Pharaoh's claim had no merit. Garrett sent word immediately, and Caleb felt a surge of hope so strong it almost hurt. "This is it," Garrett wrote in his letter. "Morrison can't ignore this. We've got 2 independent surveys saying the same thing. He has to rule in your favor." The final hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out. Caleb and Eliza spent those weeks in a state of cautious optimism. They worked the land, tended the garden, prepared for winter. But underneath it all was the hope that maybe, finally, this would be over. The night before the hearing, they sat on the porch together, watching the sun set. "What are you going to do if we win?" Eliza asked. "When we win," Caleb corrected. She smiled. "All right, when we win." He thought about it. "I'm going to plant those northern acres, spring wheat maybe, something that'll take root deep and be hard to pull up." "Sounds fitting," she said. "What about you?" he asked. "What are you going to do?" She looked out at the land, at the house, at everything they'd built together. "I'm going to keep doing what I've been doing," she said, "building a life here. With you." He pulled her close, and they sat there until the stars came out. The courtroom was packed again. Everyone who'd been at the first hearing was back, plus more. The whole county seemed invested in this now, not just in the land, but in the story of what it represented. Morrison took his seat, looking even more irritable than usual. Garrett presented the third survey results, along with Patterson's testimony and a written statement from the court-appointed surveyor. Pharaoh's lawyer tried to argue, tried to find some angle to dispute the findings, but he had nothing. The evidence was overwhelming. Morrison listened, his face giving nothing away. Then he called for a recess to review the documents. The wait was agony. Caleb sat next to Eliza, their hands clasped so tightly his fingers were numb. Around them, people whispered and speculated. After what felt like hours, Morrison returned. "I've reviewed all the evidence," he said, his voice flat. "The third survey confirms the findings of Mr. Patterson's survey. The boundary is where Mr. Mercer claims it to be. Mr. Pharaoh's claim is without merit." Caleb's breath caught. "Therefore," Morrison continued, "I'm ruling in favor of the defendant. The disputed property belongs to Caleb Mercer. The injunction on the northern 18 acres is hereby lifted. Mr. Pharaoh's claim is dismissed." The courtroom erupted. People cheered, clapped, shouted their approval. Caleb sat frozen, unable to quite believe it. They'd won. Eliza threw her arms around him, and he held her tight, burying his face in her hair. Around them, people were congratulating them, shaking their hands, but Caleb barely noticed. They'd won. When the crowd finally cleared, Garrett came over grinning. "Congratulations," he said. "The land is yours. Officially, legally, permanently." Caleb shook his hand, his throat too tight to speak. As they left the courthouse, Caleb saw Pharaoh standing by his wagon, his face thunderous. Their eyes met across the street, and for a moment Caleb thought Pharaoh might try something. But Pharaoh just climbed into his wagon and drove away. Caleb watched him go and felt the weight he'd been carrying for months finally lift. It was over. They rode home in the golden light of late afternoon, neither of them saying much. When they reached the property, Caleb helped Eliza down from the wagon, and they stood there together, looking at their land. "It's really ours," Eliza said softly. "It really is," Caleb agreed. She turned to him, her eyes bright. "So what now?" He looked at the house, at the barn, at the field stretching out before them. He thought about all the work still to be done, all the seasons yet to come, all the challenges they'd face, and he thought about facing all of it with her. "Now," he said, pulling her close, "we live." She kissed him, long and deep, and when they finally pulled apart, they were both smiling. They walked toward the house hand in hand, ready for whatever came next. Together. The first night after the ruling, Caleb woke to find Eliza's side of the bed empty. He pulled on his boots and went looking, finding her on the porch in her nightgown, wrapped in a blanket, staring out at the dark. "Can't sleep?" he asked, sitting beside her. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong," she admitted, "like this is all going to disappear." He understood that. They'd fought so hard for so long that peace felt unnatural, like the calm before another storm. "It's real," he said. "The land's ours, the fight's over." "Is it?" she asked. Pharaoh didn't look like a man who gives up easy. Caleb had been thinking the same thing, but Garrett had assured them the ruling was final, binding, with no grounds for appeal. Pharaoh was done, legally at least. "Even if he tries something," Caleb said, "we'll handle it. We've handled everything else." She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "I'm not used to winning," she said quietly. "I'm not sure I know what to do with it." "Neither am I," he admitted. "But I figure we'll learn." They sat there until the sky started to lighten, and then they went inside to start the day. The weeks that followed felt like exhaling after holding their breath for months. Caleb worked the northern acres with a kind of fierce satisfaction, plowing the soil that Pharaoh had tried to steal. Eliza planted winter wheat, her hands sure and steady as she scattered seed across the turned earth. They didn't talk about Pharaoh. They didn't talk about the court case. They just worked. And slowly, the tension that had wound itself around both of them began to loosen. One afternoon, Tom Ashford rode up with a wagon full of young apple trees. "Thought you might want these," he said, climbing down. "Got more than I need, and I figured your place could use an orchard." Caleb looked at the saplings, small and fragile in their burlap wrappings. "Tom, I can't pay." "Didn't ask you to," Tom interrupted. "You helped me when my well ran dry." "This is me returning the favor," They spent the rest of the day planting the trees along the eastern edge of the property, spacing them carefully, imagining what they'd look like in 5 years, 10 years. Eliza brought them water and watched as the orchard took shape. "It'll be beautiful," she said. "Won't see fruit for a few years," Tom warned. "But when it comes, it'll be worth the wait." After Tom left, Caleb and Eliza stood among the newly planted trees, their branches bare and vulnerable against the winter sky. "Feels like hope," Eliza said. Caleb took her hand. "Feels like home." Winter came hard that year. The first snow fell in early November, blanketing the land in white, and the temperature dropped until the morning water in the basin had a skin of ice. But the house was warm, the barn was solid, and they had enough food stored to see them through. Caleb had worried about the isolation, about being snowed in for weeks with just the two of them, but instead, he found he loved it. The quiet mornings with coffee and conversation, the evenings by the fire, Eliza mending while he whittled, both of them comfortable in the silence. The nights wrapped around each other, her warmth against his, feeling like the only two people in the world. One evening, she looked up from her sewing and said, "I'm pregnant." Caleb's hands went still on the piece of wood he'd been shaping. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," she said. "About 6 weeks along, I think." He set down his knife and crossed the room, kneeling in front of her chair. "How do you feel?" "Scared," she admitted. "And happy and terrified, all at once." He took her hands. "Me too." She smiled, a little wobbly. "You're not the one who has to carry it." "No," he agreed. "But I'm the one who has to keep you both safe. That's terrifying enough." She cupped his face. "We'll figure it out, just like everything else." He kissed her palms, her wrists, her mouth. "Yeah, we will." That night, lying in bed with his hand on her still flat stomach, Caleb felt the future shift into something real and immediate. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were building something that would outlast them both. The baby came in early summer, a girl with dark hair and Eliza's eyes. The birth was hard. 20 hours of labor with only Caleb and Mrs. Ashford, who'd come to help despite her own age and the distance. There were moments when Caleb thought he might lose them both. Moments when Eliza's screams tore something open inside him that he didn't know how to close. But when Mrs. Ashford finally placed the baby in his arms, red-faced and wailing, all that fear crystallized into something else, something fiercer. "She's perfect," Eliza whispered, exhausted but smiling. "She's ours," Caleb said, his voice thick. They named her Sarah, after Eliza's mother, and from the moment she entered the world, everything changed. Caleb had thought he understood responsibility before. He'd worked the land, fought for it, built a life from nothing. But holding Sarah, feeling the weight of her tiny body, the fragility of her existence, made all of that feel small in comparison. This was what mattered, not the land, not the fight, not even the victory. This, his wife recovering in their bed, his daughter asleep in his arms, this was what he'd been fighting for all along. The first few months were brutal. Sarah cried constantly, refused to sleep for more than 2 hours at a time, and seemed to reserve her worst moments for the middle of the night. Caleb and Eliza took turns walking her, rocking her, singing to her in voices hoarse from exhaustion. "I don't know what I'm doing," Eliza said one night, tears streaming down her face as Sarah wailed in her arms. "I can't make her stop crying." Caleb took the baby, held her against his shoulder, and bounced gently. "You're doing fine. She's fed, she's changed, she's warm. Sometimes babies just cry. But what if something's wrong? Then we'll figure it out," he said, together. Eventually, Sarah quieted, her cries fading into hiccuping breaths and then silence. Caleb laid her in the cradle they'd built, and she stayed asleep for 4 whole hours. Small victories. That's what parenthood was, Caleb learned. Small victories strung together, hoping they'd add up to something bigger. Sarah was 3 months old when Pharaoh showed up again. Caleb was in the barn, repairing a saddle, when he heard the horse. He stepped outside and felt his stomach drop. Pharaoh sat on his horse at the edge of the property, alone this time. No hired men, no surveyors, no lawyers, just him. Caleb grabbed the rifle and walked out to meet him, keeping himself between Pharaoh and the house. "You're not welcome here," Caleb said. Pharaoh raised his hands, palms out. Didn't come to cause trouble. Then why'd you come? Pharaoh looked older than Caleb remembered, tired. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, and his shoulders had a defeated slope to them. I came to say you were right, Pharaoh said. About the land, about the boundary, about all of it. Caleb didn't lower the rifle. Little late for that. I know, Pharaoh said. I wanted you to know. I fought you because I thought I deserved that land. Thought I'd earned it somehow by being here longer, by having more money. But watching you these past months, you and your wife, building something real, I realized I was wrong. Why should I believe you? Caleb asked. Pharaoh smiled, bitter. You shouldn't. I wouldn't if I were you. But it's the truth anyway. I'm leaving Mercer, selling my property, moving back east. There's nothing for me here anymore. Caleb studied him, looking for the lie, the angle. But all he saw was a broken man who'd lost something he'd never really had in the first place. What happened? Caleb asked. My wife left, Pharaoh said simply. Took our son, went back to her family in Boston, said she was tired of living with a man who cared more about winning than about her. And she was right. He paused, looking out at the land. I spent years trying to build an empire, Pharaoh continued. Thought if I could just get enough land, enough money, enough power, I'd finally be somebody. But all I did was drive away the people who mattered. And now I'm standing here looking at you with your wife and your baby and your little piece of land, and you've got everything I wanted. Not the land, the life. Caleb didn't know what to say to that. A few months ago, he would have told Pharaoh to go to hell. But holding Sarah every night, watching her grow, learning what really mattered, it had softened something in him. It's not too late, Caleb said. To go after them, to fix it. Pharaoh shook his head. Yeah, it is. Some things you break, you can't put back together. I just wanted you to know you won fair, and I'm sorry for what I put you through. He turned his horse around and started to ride away. Then he stopped, looked back. Take care of that family of yours, Mercer, he said. Don't make my mistakes. I won't, Caleb promised. Pharaoh rode off, and Caleb stood there watching until he disappeared over the hill. Then he went back to the house, where Eliza was feeding Sarah, and told her everything. Do you believe him? She asked. I think so, Caleb said. I think he finally figured out what actually matters. Too late for him, Eliza said. But not for us. She smiled, adjusting Sarah at her breast. No, not for us. Bull. The years that followed were good ones, though not easy. Nothing about frontier life was easy. There were droughts and storms, crop failures and sick livestock, winters that tested their resolve, and summers that threatened to break them. But they had each other, and that made all the difference. Sarah grew into a bright, curious child who followed Caleb around the property, asking endless questions about everything. Why did chickens lay eggs? Where did the creek come from? Why was the sky blue? Caleb answered as best he could, making up explanations when he didn't know the real ones, and Sarah seemed satisfied either way. When Sarah was 2, Eliza got pregnant again. This time, the birth was easier. A boy they named Daniel, who came into the world squalling and hungry and never really stopped. He was different from Sarah, louder and more demanding, but Caleb loved him just as fiercely. The orchard Tom had given them started producing fruit in the 5th year. The first harvest was small, just a few bushels of apples, but Eliza made pies and preserves, and they sold some at the market in town. The next year, the harvest doubled. And the year after that, it doubled again. They built a small addition onto the house, giving the children their own room. They expanded the barn, bought 2 more cows, and started raising pigs. The land that had seemed so marginal when Caleb first claimed it began to thrive under their care. Word spread about their success, and other families started settling nearby. What had been empty frontier when Caleb arrived slowly became a community, neighbors helping neighbors, barn raisings and harvest festivals, children playing together while their parents worked. Tom Ashford became a fixture at their table, a grandfather to their children in all but name. He taught Sarah how to ride and Daniel how to fish, and when he died in his sleep at 73, they buried him on a hill overlooking his property, with half the county in attendance. Caleb and Eliza stood at the grave, their children beside them, and Caleb thought about how much Tom had given them. Not just the apple trees, though those had grown into something beautiful, but the example of what it meant to be a good neighbor, a good man, someone who measured wealth not in acres or dollars, but in relationships and respect. I want to be like him, Caleb said later that night.
You already are, Eliza replied.
Nah. When Sarah was 10 and Daniel was 8, Eliza got pregnant a third time. This pregnancy was harder than the others. She was older now, 36, and her body didn't bounce back the way it had before. She spent the last 2 months confined to bed, pale and exhausted, while Caleb managed the house and the children and the farm. He was terrified. Every day, he watched her grow weaker, watched the life drain from her face, and thought about what he'd do if he lost her. The answer was always the same. He wouldn't survive it. She was the center of everything, the reason any of this mattered. But she was stronger than he gave her credit for. She'd always been stronger. The baby came 3 weeks early. Another girl they named Ruth. She was tiny, barely 5 pounds, and for the first week they weren't sure she'd make it. But Eliza nursed her constantly, slept with her on her chest, willed her to survive with the same stubborn determination she'd brought to everything else in her life. And Ruth pulled through. By the end of the first month, she'd gained weight, found her strength, and started to thrive. She's a fighter, the doctor said, just like her mother. Caleb looked at Eliza, exhausted but smiling, Ruth asleep in her arms, and felt his heart crack open all over again. Yeah, he said, just like her mother. The children grew. Sarah became serious and thoughtful, the kind of child who noticed when others were struggling and quietly found ways to help. She had Eliza's eyes and her mother's fierce sense of justice, and Caleb knew she'd grow into someone remarkable. Daniel was wild and reckless, always climbing something he shouldn't or chasing something that could hurt him. He kept Caleb on constant alert, but there was joy in him too, pure, unfiltered joy at being alive. He laughed easily, loved fiercely, and never held a grudge. Ruth was the surprise. She was small and quiet, easy to overlook in the chaos of the household. But she noticed everything, remembered everything, and had a mind that worked in ways Caleb couldn't quite follow. She taught herself to read at 4, could calculate numbers in her head faster than Caleb could write them down, and once designed a better irrigation system for the garden using nothing but string and wooden stakes. She's going to leave here one day, Eliza said, watching Ruth build something complicated with scraps of wood. She's too smart for frontier life. Maybe, Caleb said, but she'll always know where she came from. We'll make sure of that. The land continued to prosper. The orchard became their biggest source of income, producing apples and pears, and eventually peaches that people traveled from 3 counties over to buy. They built a small stand at the edge of the property, and Eliza managed the sales while Caleb managed the trees. They weren't rich, not by any measure, but they were comfortable. They had enough to feed their family, enough to save a little, enough to help neighbors when times were hard, and that was more than Caleb had ever imagined having when he first claimed this land. One evening, sitting on the porch with Eliza while the children played in the yard, Caleb said, "Do you ever think about that first day, when I found you at Pritchard's place?" "All the time," she said. "Do you regret it?" "Coming here." She looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Regret it? Caleb, this is the best thing that ever happened to me. Even with everything we went through, the fire, the court case, Pharaoh, especially because of all that," she said. "Those things made us who we are. Made this," she gestured at the land, the house, the children, "mean something." He took her hand, threading his fingers through hers the way he'd done 100 times before. "I was alone for a long time before you came," he said. "I didn't even realize how alone until you were here. You didn't just help me keep this land. You made it worth keeping." She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "We made it worth keeping, together." There was that word again, together. It had become their foundation, their promise, the thing that carried them through everything else. "Together," he repeated. Sarah was 16 when she told them she wanted to be a teacher. There was a new school being built in Ridgewood, and they were looking for someone to run it. Sarah had been helping the younger children learn to read for years, had a natural gift for it, and the town council had approached her. "It doesn't pay much," she said, "but I'd be doing something that matters." Caleb looked at his daughter, no longer a child, nearly grown now, and felt the pride swell in his chest. "Then you should do it," he said. "You're sure?" she asked. "I know you need help here." "We'll manage," Eliza interrupted. "You go be a teacher. Make us proud." Sarah hugged them both, fierce and grateful, and Caleb thought about how far they'd come.
From a woman with nothing and a man with only land, to this, a family, a legacy, children who would go out into the world and make it better.
Daniel surprised them by wanting to stay. He was 14, old enough to make his own choices, and he'd fallen in love with the land the way Caleb had. He wanted to expand the orchard, maybe start raising cattle, turn this small family farm into something bigger. "If that's what you want," Caleb said, "then we'll do it. Together." Ruth, at 12, was still figuring herself out, but Caleb could see the restlessness in her, the hunger for something beyond what this small corner of the world could offer. She'd leave eventually, he knew. And when she did, he'd support her, the same way he was supporting Sarah. Because that's what you did when you loved someone. You gave them roots, and then you gave them wings. Caleb was 45 when his back started giving him trouble. Not constantly, just enough to remind him that he wasn't young anymore, that the years of hard labor were catching up with him. He didn't complain about it, just adjusted the way he worked, let Daniel take on more of the heavy lifting. Eliza noticed, of course. She always noticed. "You should rest more," she said. "I'll rest when I'm dead," he replied. "Don't joke about that." He pulled her close, kissing her forehead. "I'm not going anywhere. Not yet." But the truth was, he could feel time moving differently now. The children were growing up, the land was established, and he wasn't building anymore. He was maintaining. It wasn't a bad feeling, exactly, just different. One afternoon, he walked out to the northern edge of the property, the acres he'd fought so hard to keep. The wheat was growing there now, tall and golden in the summer sun, and he stood in the middle of it, letting the stalks brush against his arms. This was what he'd fought for, not just the land itself, but what it represented. The right to build something, to claim a piece of the world and make it his own. To pass it on to his children so they could build on what he'd started. He heard footsteps and turned to find Eliza coming toward him, her hair gray now, but her eyes still sharp and bright. "What are you doing out here?" she asked. "Just thinking," he said. "About what?" He looked at the wheat, at the house in the distance, at the life they'd built. "About how none of this would exist if you hadn't stayed," he said. She slipped her hand into his. "None of this would exist if you hadn't let me." They stood there together, two people who'd started with nothing and built everything, and Caleb thought about what Pharaoh had said all those years ago, about how Caleb had everything Pharaoh wanted, not the land, the life. Pharaoh had been right, but he'd been wrong about one thing. It wasn't luck, it wasn't fate, it was choice. Every single day, Caleb and Eliza had chosen each other, chosen this life, chosen to fight for what mattered instead of giving up when things got hard. And that choice had made all the difference. Sarah got married when she was 22 to a kind young man who'd moved to Ridgewood to work as a blacksmith. They built a small house in town, and Sarah continued teaching, shaping the minds of a new generation. Daniel married at 25, bringing his wife to live on the property. She was a farmer's daughter from the next county, strong and capable, and she fit into their family like she'd always been there. Within a year, they had their first child, a boy they named Caleb. Holding his grandson for the first time, Caleb felt the circle complete itself. He was a grandfather now. The land would pass to Daniel, and Daniel would pass it to his children, and on, a legacy built on nothing but stubbornness and love. Ruth left when she was 18, heading east to study at a university. She wrote letters home, telling them about cities and libraries and ideas that Caleb couldn't quite wrap his mind around. But he was proud of her, proud that she'd had the courage to go after what she wanted. "Do you miss her?" Eliza asked one evening, reading Ruth's latest letter. "Every day," Caleb admitted. "But I'm glad she went. She needed something bigger than this." "And you don't mind? Mind that my daughter is brilliant and brave enough to build her own life?" He smiled. "No, I don't mind at all." Well, Caleb was 63 when he finally slowed down. Not by choice. His body simply wouldn't let him keep up the pace anymore. His back hurt constantly now. His hands were stiff with arthritis, and he got tired faster than he used to. Daniel ran the farm now, with his wife and their 3 children. Caleb still helped where he could, but mostly he sat on the porch and watched, offering advice when asked, staying quiet when it wasn't. Eliza's hair had gone completely white, and she moved slower too, but she was still beautiful to him. Still the woman who'd stepped off that wagon with nothing, who'd chosen to stay when she could have left, who'd built this life beside him one stubborn day at a time. They sat together in the evenings, watching their grandchildren play in the yard, and Caleb thought about everything they'd survived: the fire, the court case, the births, the losses, the endless work. All of it had led here, to this moment, to this peace. "We did good," he said one evening. Eliza smiled. "Yeah, we did." "You ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't found you that day?" "Sometimes," she admitted. "I'd have walked to Ridgewood, found work somewhere, maybe married someone else, maybe not. But it wouldn't have been this." "This was better," Caleb said. "This was perfect," she corrected. "Not perfect like easy, perfect like right." He kissed her hand, feeling the bones beneath the skin, the years in every line and wrinkle. "Perfect like right," he repeated. "Yeah, that's exactly what it was." Caleb died in his sleep at 67, peacefully, with Eliza beside him. His heart simply stopped, worn out from a lifetime of hard work and harder love. The funeral was packed. People came from all over, neighbors they'd helped, families they'd befriended, children Sarah had taught, people who'd bought apples from their orchard. Daniel gave the eulogy, talking about his father's stubbornness, his integrity, his quiet strength. But it was Sarah who said what mattered most. "My father taught me that the things worth having are the things you fight for," she said. "Not because they're easy, but because they matter. He fought for this land, for our family, for a life that meant something. And he won. Not because he was lucky, but because he never gave up." They buried him on the hill overlooking the property, next to where they'd buried Tom Ashford years before. Eliza stood at the grave, her children and grandchildren around her, and looked out at the land Caleb had claimed, had fought for, had loved. "Thank you," she whispered, "for giving me a home, for giving me everything." She lived another 8 years, watching Daniel's children grow, welcoming Ruth home for visits, helping Sarah with the school. She tended the garden, made preserves from the orchard fruit, told stories about Caleb to anyone who'd listen. And when she died, quiet and easy in her chair on the porch one summer evening, they buried her next to Caleb, where she'd always belonged. Years later, Ruth came back for a visit, bringing her own children to see the land their grandparents had built. Daniel's son, Caleb, now a man himself with children of his own, walked her through the property, showing her how much it had grown. The orchard stretched for acres now. The house had been expanded twice, and there were new outbuildings, new fences, new fields. But the heart of it was the same, the original house where Caleb and Eliza had lived, preserved and maintained, a reminder of where it all began. "Tell me the story again," Ruth's youngest daughter asked. "About how great-grandmother came here?" Young Caleb smiled. "She arrived with nothing, just a carpet bag and a broken promise. My great-grandfather found her, took her in, and they built all of this together, from nothing." "Was it hard?" the girl asked. "Very hard," Caleb said. "There were fires and fights, court battles and struggles, but they never gave up. They chose each other, chose this life, and they made it work." He paused, looking out at the land. "My grandfather used to say that the things worth having are the things you fight for. Not because the fight is glorious, but because what you're fighting for matters. And this," he gestured at the property, at the family gathered there. "This mattered to them more than anything." Ruth stood on the porch of the original house, her hand on the railing Caleb had built decades ago, and felt the weight of history settle over her. Her grandparents had started with nothing. Less than nothing, really. Just stubbornness and hope and a willingness to work for something better. And from that, they'd built a legacy that would outlast them by generations. Not because they were special, not because they were lucky, but because they'd chosen to fight. For the land, for each other, for a future they could barely imagine but believed in anyway. That was the lesson, Ruth thought. That was what mattered. Not that life would be easy, it wouldn't. Not that you'd win every battle, you wouldn't. But that if you found something worth fighting for, whether it was land or love or family or all three, and if you fought for it with everything you had, refusing to give up even when it seemed impossible, then you could build something that lasted, something real, something that mattered. As the sun set over the orchard, painting the sky in shades of gold and red, Ruth thought about her grandmother standing in this exact spot all those years ago, looking at a land that didn't want her, with a man who'd given her a chance when no one else would. And she thought about how that one choice to stay, to fight, to build, had rippled forward through time, creating this moment, this family, this legacy. Some people spend their whole lives searching for meaning, for purpose, for something that makes the struggle worthwhile. Caleb and Eliza had found it in each other and in the land they'd claimed together. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.